The gathering was designed to celebrate power, but beneath the luxury it existed to remind everyone who owned the night. Crystal lights reflected off polished marble floors, and the air carried the scent of expensive food, sharp cologne, and quiet fear. Men and women who had built their lives on greed and betrayal filled the room, laughing too loudly, measuring one another by wealth and influence. At the center sat the Korean Mafia boss, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit. His presence calm yet suffocating, the kind of man who did not need to speak to be obeyed. While others showed off their success, his silence dominated the room. His eyes cold, observant and calculating among the glittering tables moved servers who were barely noticed. But one black woman stood out not because she was welcomed, but because she clearly did not belong. Her simple uniform contrasted painfully with the luxury around her, and her posture carried a quiet dignity that clashed with her position. To the guests, she was invisible labor, someone beneath their notice, yet from his seat, the Korean Mafia boss watched everything. Amid the noise and arrogance, his gaze lingered on her longer than it should have, sensing a tension he could not immediately explain. In a room built on lust for power and money, something unexpected stirred an unspoken pull, faint but undeniable hinting that this night was not merely a gathering of criminals, but the beginning of a shift none of them were prepared for. She moved through the room like a shadow that no one cared to acknowledge. Dressed in a plain, faded uniform that had clearly seen too many nights like this, the black woman carried herself with careful restraint, her shoulders straight, her steps measured, as if discipline was the only thing protecting her from being swallowed by humiliation. The weight of the tray pressed into her palms, yet heavier than that was the weight of knowing she did not belong here, not in the eyes of the guests who flaunted their wealth, nor in a world where power decided who deserved respect and who did not. Everywhere she went, conversations continued as if she were air. Laughter brushed past her, careless and sharp, and hands waved in her direction without ever truly seeing her face. To them, she was just another servant hired for the night, a disposable presence meant to blend into the background and disappear by morning. Their greed-filled eyes skimmed over her dark skin and worn clothes, already dismissing her worth, already deciding her place at the very bottom of the hierarchy they worshipped. Yet beneath her quiet exterior lived a storm of endurance. This was not her first night of being overlooked, nor was it the first time she had swallowed pride to survive. Each step she took through the glittering hall reminded her how cruel the world could be when money ruled conscience. Still, she did not lower her head. There was something firm in her expression, something unbroken in the way her fingers steadied the tray, as though no amount of neglect could strip her of her inner control. Unnoticed by the crowd, but not by all, the Korean Mafia boss observed her movements with growing focus. While others saw only a server, he sensed contradiction in her presence, the contrast between her status and her composure, her poverty and her dignity. His attention followed her silently, drawn not by weakness, but by restraint. In a room overflowing with arrogance and hunger, she alone seemed untouched by desire for power, and that difference sparked something dangerous and unfamiliar within him. What began as curiosity slowly deepened into an unspoken fascination, the first quiet thread of a romance neither of them yet understood. Forming in the space between invisibility and watchful eyes, the moment arrived without warning, slipping into the night as quietly as she had. Her steps slowed as she approached the center of the room, where the air felt heavier and every glance carried judgment, even if it was never meant for her. The tray balanced in her hands trembled ever so slightly, not from clumsiness, but from exhaustion that had been building long before this night began. Her fingers tightened, her breath steadied, and for a brief second she believed she would pass through unnoticed once again. Then fate intervened. A careless shift of weight, a subtle misstep on the polished floor, and the fragile balance shattered. The tray tilted, plates slid, and in a single heartbeat the sound of breaking dishes echoed louder than the music and laughter combined. Food scattered across the marble floor, staining the perfection of the gathering with sudden chaos. Time seemed to pause as every eye turned toward her, drawn by the disruption she had not meant to cause. Heat rushed to her face as reality settled in. This was the mistake she could not afford. Her body stiffened, instinctively bracing for what always followed such moments: judgment, cruelty, and blame. The room that had ignored her seconds ago now consumed her entirely, stripping her of the invisibility that had once protected her. She stood frozen, surrounded by wealth and power that now felt sharper and more dangerous than before. Amid the rising tension, her gaze dropped briefly to the mess at her feet, not in defeat, but in control. She refused to panic, refused to beg. Inside, memories of past humiliations threatened to surface, reminders of how easily the world punished those without status. Yet she steadied herself, drawing strength from something deeper than fear. This accident did not define her, no matter how eagerly the room wished it did. From across the hall, the Korean Mafia boss witnessed the fall of the tray with silent intensity. While others reacted with shock or amusement, his focus narrowed solely on her. He noted the way she did not crumble, the way her spine remained straight despite the humiliation waiting to descend. In that brief instant, something shifted in him. What should have been an ordinary mistake became a revealing moment, exposing her resilience and awakening a protective pull he did not yet name. The accident did more than disrupt the gathering. It cracked open the illusion of control, setting into motion a chain of events that would bind their fates in ways neither of them could escape. The silence that followed the crash was brief, sharp, and cruel. It broke not with concern, but with laughter that rippled through the room like a sickness, loud and deliberate, as if each person wanted to prove they were far removed from her mistake. Smirks spread across polished faces, and eyes filled with superiority settled on her as though she were a spectacle put on display for their amusement. In a place built on dominance, her accident became an excuse to remind her and themselves of where she stood in the cruel order of the world. Judgment wrapped around her from all sides. The same people who had ignored her existence moments earlier now studied her closely, weighing her worth and finding it lacking. Their expressions dripped with disdain, fueled by greed and arrogance, by the belief that money granted them the right to strip another human being of dignity. Her dark skin, her simple uniform, her silence, everything about her became ammunition for silent cruelty. She was no longer just a server. She was a mistake, an inconvenience, a reminder of a life they never wanted to acknowledge. Yet she did not collapse under their gaze. Shame tried to claw its way into her chest, but she held herself still, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but her face remained composed, her eyes steady, even as humiliation burned through her. Years of endurance had taught her this lesson well. The world often mistook silence for weakness, and she would not correct them, not tonight. As the humiliation deepened, something far more dangerous brewed beneath the surface of the room. Power thrived on moments like these, moments where the weak were crushed publicly to entertain the strong. But what the crowd failed to notice was that their cruelty was being witnessed by someone who ruled through control, not chaos. From his place among them, the Korean Mafia boss watched the spectacle unfold, his expression unreadable. While others fed on her embarrassment, he absorbed every detail: the way she stood alone, the way she bore the weight of their ridicule without pleading. In that moment, the imbalance of power became unmistakably clear to him. The laughter in the room felt reckless, foolish, and disrespectful, not toward her, but toward him. A quiet shift occurred, unseen by those enjoying her humiliation. What they thought was harmless mockery was, in truth, the spark of their own downfall. And at the center of it stood a woman they believed to be powerless, unaware that their cruelty had placed her directly under the protection and growing interest of the most dangerous man in the room. The laughter had not yet faded when the atmosphere of the room changed so abruptly it felt as though the air itself had been cut. Chairs stopped shifting, smiles froze, and every sound slowly died under the weight of an unspoken command. The Korean Mafia boss rose from his seat with measured calm, his movements smooth and deliberate, commanding attention without asking for it. His presence towered over the gathering, and in that instant, the power balance of the room tilted unmistakably in his favor. Silence spread, heavy and suffocating. The same people who had laughed moments earlier now held their breath, suddenly aware of how far they had overstepped. His dark eyes moved across the room, cold and assessing, before settling on the black woman standing alone near the shattered remnants of the fallen tray. He did not look at her with pity or desire, but with intent, as if seeing beyond the surface of humiliation to something far more significant. As he stood there, the room realized a painful truth. His attention was never accidental. While others indulged in cruelty and arrogance, he had been watching patiently, waiting for the moment that revealed everyone's true character. The mockery, the greed, the careless laughter, it had all been noted. And now so had she. The contrast between her quiet endurance and their loud cruelty sharpened his focus, stirring a rare sense of respect that unsettled him more than anger ever could. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. She felt the shift before she understood it, sensing that the ridicule surrounding her had lost its power. His gaze did not strip her bare. It anchored her, steady and commanding, offering protection without a single word. For the first time that night, she was no longer alone. The man who ruled the room had chosen to see her, and that recognition sent a strange warmth through her chest, an unfamiliar blend of relief and dangerous hope. The guests understood what she could not yet fully grasp. His decision to stand was not merely an act of authority, but the beginning of consequence. Those who laughed had unknowingly crossed a line, and the woman they had humiliated now stood under the watchful eyes of a man whose influence could destroy them without effort. As he remained standing, calm and unyielding, it became clear that this night had reached its turning point, one that would bind power, fate, and the first spark of a forbidden romance into a single, irreversible moment. What drew his attention was not the accident itself, but the way she existed in its aftermath. As the tension thickened around them, the Korean Mafia boss studied her with a focus that bordered on unsettling, his sharp mind cataloging details others had overlooked entirely. Her breathing was controlled, slow and deliberate, betraying discipline rather than panic. Her hands, though still, carried no trace of desperation. There was restraint in her posture, a quiet defiance that did not demand attention yet refused to surrender to humiliation. He had spent years reading people, learning to detect weakness, deception, and hunger within seconds. Most in the room wore their greed openly, their ambitions leaking through polished smiles. She was different. There was no calculation in her eyes, no plea for mercy, only a guarded calm shaped by experience rather than innocence. That contrast unsettled him. A woman in her position should have been breaking under the pressure, yet she stood composed, as though this was not the worst moment she had endured in her life. The realization sparked a deeper curiosity, one he did not welcome but could not dismiss. He wondered what kind of past carved such control into someone forced to live on the margins. What had she survived to make tonight feel like something she could endure? Beneath her silence, he sensed strength tempered by loss, pride sharpened by betrayal. These were qualities he recognized intimately, qualities forged in the same fire that had built his own empire. As his gaze lingered, an unfamiliar tension stirred within him. It was not desire in its usual form, nor was it simple sympathy. It was recognition. In a world where power devoured the weak without remorse, he had found someone who carried their scars quietly, without turning them into weapons or excuses. That restraint intrigued him more than any display of beauty or submission ever could. For her, his attention felt like standing beneath a storm that had not yet broken. She could sense it, an intense awareness fixed on her, neither cruel nor comforting, but undeniably present. Though she did not fully understand why, she felt the weight of his curiosity settle around her like a shield. In that unspoken exchange, something subtle took root. What began as observation edged dangerously close to fascination, and beneath that fascination stirred the first fragile thread of connection, one born not from words, but from the rare recognition of strength reflected in another's soul. The shift in power was undeniable, even though nothing had been spoken. The room, once loud with mockery, now moved cautiously, as if every breath required permission. The Korean Mafia boss did not need to raise his voice or make threats. His presence alone rewrote the rules. What moments earlier had been public humiliation was quietly transformed into restraint, and the crowd, so eager to laugh, now feared becoming the next spectacle. She felt it immediately. The weight pressing on her chest eased, replaced by a strange calm she had not expected. Though no one had apologized, the cruelty had lost its sharp edge. She was no longer surrounded by laughter but by uneasy silence. And in that silence, she understood something important: she was being protected. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the most dangerous way possible. Openly and without explanation, she lowered herself to correct the mistake. Every movement carried a different meaning. What should have been degrading became deliberate. The eyes that once judged her now avoided her entirely, unwilling to risk crossing the invisible line drawn by the man standing watch. Each careful motion she made felt less like submission and more like control reclaimed. The room was forced to witness not her weakness, but their own sudden discomfort. From where he stood, the Korean Mafia boss observed the effect of his silent intervention. This was how power truly functioned, not through chaos, but through presence. By allowing the moment to unfold under his watch, he ensured that everyone understood the cost of disrespect. His attention remained fixed on her, not possessive, but resolute, as though daring anyone to challenge his unspoken command. For her, this protection stirred something unfamiliar and dangerous. Gratitude blended with a quiet pull toward him, an awareness that went beyond survival. She did not need to look at him to feel it, the certainty that, in a room full of predators, one man had chosen to stand between her and the world. In that subtle act, something shifted inside her. Protection became trust, and trust began its slow, inevitable transformation into something deeper, something that neither power nor fear could easily control. Later, when the room's noise had faded into distant murmurs and the night had grown heavy with tension, he called her away from the eyes of the crowd. The private chamber was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners, and the air carried a mixture of expensive leather, faint smoke, and the weight of authority. Here, away from laughter and judgment, the Korean Mafia boss's presence was no longer just commanding, it was magnetic, drawing attention not by spectacle but by an almost dangerous stillness. He observed her quietly at first, noting the way she moved through the space, her posture still poised despite the earlier embarrassment. There was no overt softness in his gaze, yet beneath the precision of his calculation, there was interest, and perhaps the faintest acknowledgement of admiration. She, in turn, felt the shift immediately, the subtle difference between being seen as weak and being recognized as capable, though in ways that unsettled her. In that room, the power dynamic felt entirely different. He asked no questions aloud, yet every measured movement, every slight change in expression, demanded attention. He was testing her not cruelly, not angrily, but with an intensity that made it impossible to hide anything. Her past, her endurance, her capacity to survive and remain composed under pressure, all of it was visible to him in ways the crowd could never perceive. And in that visibility, a strange intimacy formed. She realized that her mistake at the gathering had not defined her, but revealed her to someone capable of seeing beyond appearances. And for him, she was no longer a simple server, no longer an object to be ignored or mocked. She was a puzzle, a challenge, and perhaps a rare presence that could match the meticulous control he wielded in every aspect of his life. In the silence between them, awareness deepened. The night's events had brought them together in a space where curiosity, respect, and the faint stirrings of something far more dangerous began to intertwine. The layers of the night began to peel away, revealing what had long been hidden beneath the polished veneer of wealth and power. In the quiet of the private room, the Korean Mafia boss studied her carefully, and through that scrutiny, pieces of her story began to emerge, not through words, but through the subtle tension in her movements, the restrained edge in her gaze, and the faint scars that traced silent history across her expression. She had endured more than most could imagine, and the circumstances that forced her into the role of a server were rooted in betrayal and greed, the kind that festered in high places while the world remained oblivious. It became clear that the laughter and mockery of the gathering were not random. Someone among the guests was directly responsible for her plight, someone who had manipulated power and wealth to suppress her, to keep her invisible and subordinate. The realization of this truth tightened the room with unspoken intensity. The boss understood immediately, as he always did, who had orchestrated the cruelty and why. It was a combination of ambition, envy, and the desire to maintain control at another's expense. For her, the weight of revelation was double-edged. Relief mingled with the bitterness of knowing she had been targeted and used, Yet a sense of validation began to rise. For the first time, someone with real authority, not a fellow guest driven by greed or cruelty, saw the injustice, acknowledged it, and recognized her resilience in surviving it. The Korean Mafia boss's observation went beyond simple recognition. He understood the stakes, the danger she had navigated, and the latent power in her endurance. Her presence, calm yet unbroken, was not merely a story of suffering, it was evidence of a strength that could no longer be ignored. In uncovering this hidden truth, he silently resolved that the forces responsible for her humiliation would be held accountable, and that the woman who had been dismissed by society would, under his watch, step into a position of influence she had never been allowed before. Did I end that revelation? A subtle bond began to form between them, one built on mutual recognition of survival, a quiet respect, and the first hint of a connection that went beyond authority or fascination. The hidden truths of the night had exposed more than betrayal. They had illuminated potential, power, and the beginnings of something far more dangerous and intimate. The atmosphere of the gathering, once dominated by arrogance and ridicule, shifted entirely under his careful orchestration. The Korean Mafia boss had observed long enough to know exactly who had orchestrated her humiliation, who had hidden behind laughter to mask their greed and betrayal. One by one, he began to dismantle the carefully constructed facades, exposing their secrets, their thefts, and their lies with precision. The room, filled with people who had once felt untouchable, now grew tense, their confidence cracking under the weight of revelation. The guests who had mocked her were forced to confront the consequences of their cruelty. Wealth, influence, and status, things they had wielded like weapons against the powerless, were revealed as fragile and easily stripped away. The laughter that had echoed moments before became hesitant, uncertain, and eventually died altogether as the truth laid bare their corruption. In watching them falter, the woman felt an unfamiliar sense of vindication. Her endurance had not been in vain. The very people who sought to diminish her were now exposed for what they truly were. The boss's attention never wavered from her. Every subtle shift, every glance, reinforced the unspoken truth. She had survived not only by circumstance but through a quiet resilience that he deeply respected. The power dynamic of the room had inverted, and she stood at its center, no longer merely a spectator of the world's cruelty, but an undeniable presence whose dignity demanded recognition. And that inversion of fortune, the seeds of trust and something more took root. What had begun as humiliation had transformed into a moment of strength, and in witnessing it, a subtle connection between them deepened. The room had become a stage for justice, for revelation, and for the first fragile stirrings of romance, hidden beneath the precision of authority and the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual respect. For her, the humiliation of the night had passed. For him, the intrigue it had sparked had only begun. The reckoning was swift and unyielding. Those who had laughed, who had jeered and pointed, who had treated her as if she were less than human, were forced to face the consequences of their own actions. The Korean Mafia boss moved with quiet authority, ensuring that their downfall was complete and undeniable. Positions of influence, ill-gotten wealth, and reputations carefully constructed over years were stripped away in front of everyone, leaving no room for denial or excuse. What had seemed like a simple gathering of elites had become a stage for accountability, and the lesson was clear. Cruelty and greed carry their own cost. The woman watched as justice unfolded. There was no revenge in the conventional sense, no senseless destruction, no hasty punishment. Instead, it was precise, deliberate, and unavoidable, reflecting the careful balance of power she had witnessed in the boss from the beginning. Those who had mocked her now understood the fragility of their arrogance. The humiliation they had imposed on her returned to them tenfold, not by chance, but through the measured control of someone who commanded fear and respect in equal measure. In the midst of this reckoning, her own strength became evident not through retaliation, but through the quiet dignity she had maintained from the moment the tray fell. It was her composure, her resilience, and her refusal to crumble that had drawn the boss's attention in the first place. And it was the same qualities that ensured the scales of justice fell precisely where they belonged. As the room absorbed the consequences, a shift occurred between her and the boss. Mutual recognition of strength, endurance, and moral clarity had formed a bridge between them. While others had wielded power carelessly, they had seen the gravity of its use. In that silent acknowledgement, romance began to bloom, not the shallow attraction of desire, but a deeper, more dangerous connection forged through shared understanding, trust, and the unspoken promise that justice, when wielded with purpose, could create something both powerful and intimate. The night ended not with noise or celebration, but with a quiet realignment of power. The woman who had entered the gathering as a timid, overlooked server emerged transformed not by chance, but through resilience, observation, and the protection of the man who had watched her from the start. She was no longer invisible. The world around her had been forced to acknowledge her presence, her dignity, and the quiet strength that had carried her through humiliation and fear. The Korean Mafia boss, having orchestrated both the exposure of the greedy and the subtle elevation of her standing, offered her a role far beyond what she could have imagined. It was not a token of charity, nor a simple position of safety, but a strategic place where her insight, composure, and intelligence could flourish. Her past struggles had shaped a mind capable of discernment and endurance, qualities rare even among those born into power. In this new position, she could operate with agency, influence, and respect, things she had never been allowed to possess before. For her, the change was profound. The weight of invisibility, of being dismissed, and of enduring cruelty lifted as she stepped into a space where her abilities mattered. She was seen for the first time not as a mistake or a servant, but as someone whose choices carried consequence and whose presence demanded attention. It was a transformation that carried quiet satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that every elevation in life must be earned through resilience and integrity. The connection between her and the boss deepened in subtle ways. Respect had grown into something more potent, a thread of trust and unspoken understanding that hinted at romance, yet remained restrained by the intensity of circumstance. In the shadows of wealth, danger, and power, they had discovered an unusual partnership. She had gained more than protection. She had gained recognition, influence, and the rare opportunity to step into a life shaped by her own strength, guided by someone who understood both the cost of survival and the value of loyalty. The night closed on a quiet, powerful note. Humiliation had been reversed, injustice corrected, and a new path forged not through luck, but through courage, resilience, and the careful orchestration of power by one who saw her potential and would ensure it could no longer be ignored. Amid the aftermath of upheaval and realignment, a subtle tension began to weave between them, a tension neither had named, yet both could feel. The Korean Mafia boss, always composed and calculating, found himself drawn to the quiet strength of the woman who had endured ridicule and emerged unbroken. His attention, once purely strategic, now carried an edge of something personal, an almost imperceptible softness beneath the veneer of authority. She, in turn, became aware of his gaze in ways that unsettled and intrigued her. It was not the kind of attention that demanded or intimidated. It was measured, deliberate, and charged with a dangerous curiosity. Every glance he cast her way seemed to acknowledge not just her survival, but the depth of her resilience and the intelligence behind her restraint. In moments of stillness, she felt the pull of something more than gratitude or respect, a growing connection that hovered between caution and desire. Their interactions were silent, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else in the room. A tilt of his head, a brief pause in his observation, the faintest shift in posture, all communicated a recognition that went far beyond words. For her, it was both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent her life surviving, and now she was navigating something entirely unfamiliar. A tension that promised closeness, intimacy, and perhaps vulnerability. In the shadows of authority and danger, romance began its quiet bloom. It was not yet a fire, but a spark, growing slowly amid trust, admiration, and the mutual acknowledgement of power and resilience. Neither had spoken of it, yet both felt its presence, an unspoken bond forming amid the aftermath of chaos, injustice, and the careful orchestration of consequence. In that silence, a new chapter of connection had begun, fragile yet undeniable, hinting at the deeper entanglement that awaited them in the days to come. The night drew to a close with a sense of inevitability, as if the events of the evening had been guided by forces beyond the room itself. The guests who had once wielded arrogance and cruelty now understood the weight of their actions. Those who had laughed at the woman, mocking her poverty and vulnerability, were left exposed, humbled, and stripped of the power they had relied on to dominate. Justice had been delivered not through vengeance, but through precise, measured consequence, showing that cruelty and greed never go unpunished. The woman stood transformed, not merely protected, not merely elevated, but recognized for her strength, resilience, and intelligence. Her journey through humiliation had brought her to a position where she could command respect, influence outcomes, and navigate a world that had tried to suppress her. She had endured, survived, and risen above those who had sought to diminish her, proving that dignity and courage are forces that no amount of mockery can overcome. The Korean Mafia boss remained by her side, his presence a constant reminder of both protection and connection. Their bond, forged through observation, understanding, and unspoken admiration, hinted at romance, but it was rooted in respect and the shared recognition of strength. In their partnership, power and intimacy intertwined, demonstrating that love can grow even in the harshest of circumstances when built on trust and acknowledgement of resilience. In the end, the moral was clear. Those who belittle, mock, or underestimate the seemingly powerless are often blind to the strength they cannot see and the consequences that await them. The woman had turned the night of humiliation into a night of triumph, and in doing so, had not only altered her own fate, but had also revealed the fragility of arrogance and the enduring power of courage. Justice had been served, balance restored, and a new chapter of life and an unspoken romance begun, leaving the room forever changed.